Alrighty. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. If you don't know me already, my name is Ansh. I am the current corporate director for Freetail, and I'm also going to be giving a quick workshop today on web development using Flask, which is a Python library. I've been told that I speak a little fast, so if I am going too fast for anyone in this room, please go ahead and shoot a chat message or let Didi know, and I will do my best to slow down for you. So let's get started. Quickly, what is web development? I mean, anytime you've seen a website, it was made with standard web development techniques. That's basically it. It's the basis for creating and putting stuff out there for us developers. The basic structure of web development, there are two big components that you need to know about. So there's the front-end code and there's back-end code. Front-end code is basically the code that defines what you see when you go to a website. So if you go to Facebook, right, you see all your friends' posts, or if you go to Google, you see the home search page. That's all written by front-end code. Back-end code, on the other hand, is where all of the data is stored. So, for example, your front-end code doesn't just get the data out of nowhere. There has to be a place for all of your friends' photos to be stored, and that lives in the back-end code. Let me really quick do this. Okay, perfect. So there are a lot of differences between front-end and back-end code, mainly what they do, but also the technologies that you use to develop each one are very, very different. Front-end, you usually stick with HTML, which is short for hypertext markup language, CSS to style it, which is cascading style sheets, and then JavaScript to write sort of the back-end interaction. Whereas with back-end code, you can kind of use whatever you want. So most of the standard programming language you would learn in a computer science class, like Java or Python, C++, that's all fair game for back-end stuff. And you would program it much the same way that you would in any other class for any other project, as we will see shortly. This is just generally what the kind of structure of any sort of web application looks like. So you have the front end, and again, that's what's facing the user. So that's what the user sees anytime they type, Facebook, Google.com. And then with the way it works is that the front end code will make what we call requests to the back end anytime it needs some kind of data. There are two major types of requests. So there are GET requests, the idea being that it's trying to get data from the back end. And then there are POST requests, meaning it's just trying to post data or put more data in the backend code. And we'll see later that it doesn't really matter which type of request you use. You can kind of use either one for either thing, but there is a standard sort of like technique for a sort of like general guideline when you should use GET and when you should use POST, which will just make it easier for other engineers to understand your code. Usually what a backend setup will also do is interact with a database because it's much harder to, well, it's usually much faster, and it also allows you to store way more information than if you were to just store them in a variable in your backend code. But that part is also optional. For example, if you're making just a small application, maybe a game that's only going to be used by a few people, you can just store it in variables in your backend rather than going through the extra step of putting it in a database. That's it. That's all I have for the presentation part. But now we're going to go through a quick code demonstration. So if anyone has any questions before I start that, please let me know. I will wait for a minute or two, or like 20 seconds.
When you're doing the front end stuff, is there any particular reason you'd choose HTML over CSS or?
So most of the time you're going to use both, and we'll see that very soon. But the way HTML works is like HTML is what defines what elements are on the screen. So it'll say, hey, put the Google logo here. But CSS is what's going to actually style the elements and say, okay, make it this color or position it this way depending on the screen size. So HTML absolutely almost has to be there. In fact, when you type HTTP into a browser, it's a request that's asking for HTML. So HTML is always going to be there in a web page. CSS is kind of optional if you want to make your web page look better. And what we'll be doing today, we'll be using HTML without CSS. Are there any other quick questions before I dive into a code example? Alrighty, let's get started then. You guys are welcome to try to code along with me if you like, but I actually recommend just kind of watching for now and then trying to install the necessary libraries later. As always, the recording will be available on YouTube, so you could just go back and watch it again. Send me a Slack message with any parts that you're confused about, and I'll be happy to help you. So let's get started. Let's pull up a quick folder here. This is just a general folder that I wrote. We are going to start by writing a little bit of Python code. So I will create a new file, call it application.py. All right, and the way we're going to structure our code, we are going to be using a library called Flask, which is sort of like a web library for Python that allows you to receive requests with Python code. If you have not yet installed Flask, you can do so by running the command, I think, or maybe if you already have pip, it's just pip install Flask. Yeah, so as you can see, it says requirement already satisfied because I already have it, but that should get Flask for you. First thing we want to do is import Flask, import Flask, and send file. Those are the two things we would need from the Flask library. And then at the beginning of every Flask file, we write this line of code, which basically just says, this is a Flask app, so treat it like a Flask app when you try to run it. Okay, and then what we do is we have to define our receivers. And what a receiver is basically saying, okay, when you go to this URL, I'm going to return you the following information. It takes the form of a function, the same way you would write any other function in Python, except it has something special at the beginning, which we call an annotation. So a Flask annotation looks like this. And this is the function that we will write. All right, another thing you can also add optionally to the annotation is you can add an array, a list here. You could say methods equals get. All right, and what that will do is that will make it so that you can only use a get method or a get request, as opposed to a post request in order to call this specific method. Again, it doesn't really matter which kind of request you use, but this is just good engineering practice. Sometimes browsers might make assumptions about which type of request you're using, so it's just good practice to do this. And what we're going to do here is, all we're going to do is return a file. So we're going to use return send file, which is the library we imported earlier, and we're going to call that file index.html. And let's write that index.html file real quick. Okay, so what this is, the idea is here, is that when we run the server, and when we go to this following URL, it should just return the index.html file that we have defined here. There'll be another workshop later for how specifically to write HTML code. So I'll just breeze through it a little for now. That's the general structure of any sort of HTML document. And in the body of the website, we're just going to say, hello, my name. Cool. So again, what should happen is that when we start our server and go to the following URL, it's just going to return this HTML file, which has this text here. How do we start it, you might ask? So we have to open a command prompt. If you need help on using one of these, then go to the Ultimate Hackathon starting guide or just look up a tutorial. It's pretty easy to get the hang of. Find wherever your project is. Mine is right here. Make sure you can see both your application and your index file. And then you can use Flask run to start your app. What happened? Oh, I see. Whenever you run a Flask app, you have to set this environment variable called Flask app, which says like, okay, this is the file I want you to run. So for Windows, it's just set Flask app equals application.py. If you're on Linux or Mac, I think instead of set, you say export, but it's basically the same. Then you just type in Flask run. Perfect, perfect. So this is what it should look like on success. It says it's running at the following link, HTTP 127.0.0.1. This is basically the IP address that your computer uses to refer to itself. So it's saying, okay, it's running on my own port, at port 5000. And if we go to Chrome and just type that in, it should work. Unless I did something wrong. Seems like I did something wrong. Instead of typing 127.0.0.1, you can also type localhost, but it seems to not be working. Let's see. I have no idea why that might be happening. Oh, there it is. Okay, cool. Perfect. So it worked. Should work if I also type the old link. There we go. All right. So again, it returned the file, and we defined the file to simply have this text in the body. Moving on, let's now do something a little more complicated. So let's go back to our code. Here we have the HTML file. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a button. And then when I click that button, it's going to send a request to the backend code. and it's going to receive some sort of text, and then I will display that text on the screen. So let's get started. First thing we have to do is create a button, which we do in HTML like this. We'll say click me. Actually, before I move on to this part, are there any questions about the Python index interaction that we had for this initial section? No. All right, perfect. So we'll create a button, click me. And the way we specify buttons, we have an on-click attribute, which basically says, okay, when you click the button, what do you do? What we're going to do is we're going to run a JavaScript function, and we're going to say, let's call it, I don't know, send request. All right, so all this code is saying is that, okay, when I hit this button, call the send request function, which we will define very soon. And then I will also include a small like thing here just for the text. This is where we will keep our response when we get it. Okay, looks good. Now all we have to do is define our send request button. So we will use a script. So basically a script tag in HTML is just saying, okay, this is actually JavaScript code, so execute it as JavaScript code instead of HTML. And we can go ahead and define our send request function here. All right, so what we will want to do first is create the receiver for that request. So we can use any sort of URL we want, right? So we can say app URL example. Make sure your URL starts with this / otherwise we'll have no idea what you're doing. Since we're not actually posting any information, we can go ahead and make this a get URL as well. Return. What do we want to return? We can just return example. Or what's a good movie quote? What's a good movie? May the force be with you. Why not? Okay. So it's all it's doing is it's saying, okay, when we call the string example, we're going to return the string may the force be with you. And if we want to see this, we can optionally restart our Flask server just by hitting Control-C, starting the server, going to our web browser, and typing /example. Boom. But that's not what we want to do. We want to go to our home page and we want to make it so it shows up in the button. So we're back here. All right, and now we're going to do the kind of hard part, which is basically just making the request. What we're going to do to make that request, we're going to use something called Jquery, which is part of a library called Ajax, which is used in JavaScript. It requires you to have this line of code at the beginning. You can look up this line of code, or if you're watching on YouTube, I'll probably just include this line of code in the description, so you can copy and paste it. But this is going to allow us to make what's called an Ajax request. And the way we write an Ajax request is just like this. So we'll say $Ajax. All right, and then all we have to do is kind of specify what kind of request we're making. So the first, we will specify a type to get. We have to specify where we're making the request. So if you remember, the URL we used was example. Let's see, try to get this right. All right, and this part right here basically says, okay, if the request was a success, then let data store the variable that came back from the request and use this function to figure out what to do. And what are we going to do? Well, we defined this thing right here saying that we wanted this to store whatever our data was. So we will say document.get by ID response. This is a very common JavaScript method. And basically all it does is say, okay, find whatever element in this entire script has the ID response, which is this one, and then change its inner HTML to whatever you want. In this case, we want to set it to equal to data, which is the string we returned from earlier. So that should be it. What we were trying to do here, we're going to hit a button and then hopefully be able to say, have this string show up in our web page. Let's restart our server. Pop up in here. Okay. I should probably include breaks just in case, just to make it a little easier to read. Okay, that'll just make it nicer to look at, kind of. All right, and boom, perfect. Yeah, so that's it. That's a basic GET request. Today, here, all I did was return a string in the Python code. But you can imagine that, like, you can create arrays, tuples, lists, whatever kind of data structure you want. you can return whatever kind of data you want from that structure. You can return a string, you can return a whole list of items, you can return a bunch of numbers, and you can do whatever you want with that data in this function right here, where you just receive the data. All right, so that is the second part of what we were coding today. Before I move on to the third and final part, does anyone have any questions about what I just did?
So the app root thing, like what does this string, like this slash example, actually mean? Like what is the point of
Sure.
that? I didn't
Yeah, sure. So this slash example, right? It means this is the URL that is going to in turn call this method. So anytime somebody says server slash example, we're going to return this method and let them do whatever they want with this data. So as you've seen, there are two ways we can do this, right? We could go to the browser and just type in slash example, which will return the data like this. Or as we just saw, we wrote code to find the example and then return the data right here. So that's it. So you can define the URL to be whatever you want. You can return whatever kind of data you want. You just have to be a little bit careful to make sure that it's returning the type of data that you want.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, perfect. Well, then in that case, let's go ahead and write the last piece of code. I'm gonna put a couple breaks in here. Okay, and what I wanna do here, this is going to be a simple post request example. And it's gonna be very, very simple. All we're gonna do is have the user type in their first name, and then they can, it'll just send back a greeting saying, hi, whatever your name is. So a very simple example, but again, you can imagine there being a lot more data and sort of database interactions going on in the back end once you guys get to that level. All right, let's go ahead and define our form. Okay, so first thing we want to do is include an input type text. This basically means a text box where you can type in some sort of field. All right, and we want to include a label for that input. Okay, so what does this look like? Yeah, perfect. And then we want to have a button to allow them to actually submit what their first name is. So let's define a button. We will define an on-click for this, exactly the same as we did before. This time we'll call it send first name. All right, that should be it. Okay, now we have to define our send first name function. So we'll define that next to our send request function, make it an independent thing. Alrighty, so first thing we need to do is we need to actually get the first name from somewhere. The ID that we use for the input that we made earlier is right here, fname. So we're going to get by fname. And then dot value is the attribute we use to refer to whatever is currently in the text box. So if this works correctly, then this first name variable should store whatever the first name they have input is. Okay, then we're going to make an Ajax request, just like earlier. Okay, what's different about this Ajax request? First, we're going to try to use a different type. We're going to use post. URL, we can define it to be /name, or we'll say fname plus first name. I will explain what this does in a second. And then we can define our success function exactly the same. Okay, oh, I almost forgot. We have to make a place for it to go. So we'll say h1 ID. Right, and then what do we want to do? We want to do the exact same thing as before. So we're just going to set ID response. Or is it name response? My bad. Name response. Inner HTML equals the data that we get back. All right. Okay. So two things that we've changed, right? The first thing that we've changed is the type of method that we're using, post. And when we define our Python function, we will take that into account. So let's see here. I believe I used to add name. We're going to only allow post methods here. Reading the name of these methods doesn't really matter. Okay, and then the other thing that we changed here is that we changed the URL a little bit. So immediately after the URL, we have this part, right? This is what we're going to use to define our Python sort of thing. But then when you include a question mark, anything that comes after the question mark is what we call a parameter. So basically what it means is like something that you want to send along with your request, some kind of data that you're trying to send to the server and asking the server to do something with. So here we are sending a parameter called fname, and we are setting it equal to the value that we have obtained earlier, which is first name. So what should happen is that a user will type in something into this text box. We will click the button. It will go as a parameter called fname to the backend, which we will now do something with. And the way you retrieve information from the front end, you will say fname. So this basically just says retrieve the parameter called fname. It is very, very important that you get this parameter title and this parameter thing to match. Otherwise, you'll be sending a parameter with one name and asking for a parameter with a different name, and then it'll have no idea what the hell you're doing. We can initialize a quick greeting variable, which will just be like, hi there, plus name, plus. All right, so you can imagine this will say like, hi there, Ansh, exclamation mark. And then we will just return that greeting variable. So again, all we're returning this time is just a string. Of course, you can return more complicated data structures and do more complicated stuff with that as well. This should be it. So real quick, let's review what we're doing. We're going to type in our first name into here, hit the button, and it should send a request through here with the first name as the parameter. It'll get over here. Name is what is going to be set to whatever the user had input in the text box. It'll create a greeting, return that greeting, and then we will set name response, which is this variable, to what we have just received. Seems like a mouthful, but let's see if we did it right. Remember to restart your server anytime you make a Python code change. Otherwise, it's not going to register that change. So real quick, what we did before is still working. Let's use Trevor's name, Trevor. And it did not work, so let's see what went wrong. Trevor equals 1. Why is that? Oh, okay. Request is, oh, I see, yeah. Okay, so make sure you use your tools to figure out what's going wrong with your code. You have access to inspect element stuff, and then you also have access to the terminal that you used. If you see over here, it says that the name request is not defined, meaning that if you go back to my Python code, it has no idea what this is. And that's because we forgot to import it. So just import it like that. Flask will include everything you need. Just make sure you have the right imports. Let's try running it again. And hopefully. There it is. All right, that is about it. Does anyone have any final questions regarding anything that I have covered here today? A couple things in chat. Okay, all right, thanks, Joseph, I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, web development is a pretty key skill. As you can imagine, this hardly looks anything like Google or any sort of website you might see online. There's a lot of things you can do here. You can style it with CSS. You can include more JavaScript, and you can get more data from the backend. You can use a database for security. There's lots of different places you can go. I highly recommend checking out our other workshops if you want to take this a little bit further. But this is sort of like the same structure that you'll be seeing throughout very, very many projects throughout your journey into the vast world that is computer science. All right, if there are no other questions, then we can stop the recording, and I think we are about done.